Welcome back, friends, to another episode of Liminal Phrames. It is mid-August 2024. Been a hot summer where I am in Western North Carolina. I know that's not too far from you, Darren, so it's been a little bit hotter than I remember last year. Maybe even heat's not the right word, but it's been muggier. So those of you who live in the swampier climates know what I'm talking about. The humidity has been higher, and you walk outside, even though it's not that high on the thermostat, it feels a lot hotter just because of the stickiness of the air. But nevertheless, it is starting to get a little bit cooler in the evenings, which I very much enjoy. And I got to say, Darren, one thing that I've been doing lately that's started to change my routine is every morning I've been doing about an hour-long walk in my neighborhood with a 20-pound weighted vest. So I've been carrying around this weighted vest just to try to improve my health a little bit further, improve my cardiovascular health and fitness. And it's been a challenge. I've not done something like that before. Getting up early and getting those steps in. There are definitely mornings where you're like, I'd rather just hit the snooze button and go back to bed. But honestly, it's been very invigorating for me to go after that and see how far I can take it. So I'm going to try to get through the month of August. Going every day with this ruck, and we'll see how it goes. But so far, so good. Very happy with it. What's going on with you? I feel like it's been ages since we've had a Liminal Phrames episode, but it hasn't been that long. It just feels that long. So how are things going?
Things are going well. I think a lot of that comes down to what has happened personally and in the world, and that's what makes it feel like a large amount of time must have amassed since we last did an episode. But yeah, things are good. I'm also looking forward to the fall, as I keep saying, looking forward to the coolness that's coming. Like you, I'm noticing hints of it here and there in the air, which always feels good. And when you gave your example of the morning weighted vest thing, of course, I'm imagining the Rocky theme song, you running up steps and preparing for the big moment. So awesome.
Yeah, well, it's not. It's sort of like that. Yeah, I like to imagine that it is like that. It's a lot less like that, though. In reality, I'm often listening to podcasts on philosophy and metaphysics while I'm walking, or I also try to not listen to anything at all sometimes, just to take in the sounds of nature because there's so much going on. In fact, just a few days ago, in subsequent days, I saw a big black bear each morning, and when you see a black bear on your walk, you just sort of wait. You just stop the walk and observe and wait for the bear to move on its way, and it does, and then you resume the walk that you're on. So, but it's a reminder that we share this wonderful world with all of this amazing nature, and it's got its own habits and ways, and that we're in some ways kind of intruding on those habits and ways just with whatever we decide to do. I know we're a part of that story. We're an intricate part of that story, but so much complexity, so much beauty is happening around us all the time. And for most of us, we just don't even know. We're really kind of locked up in our own walled spaces and, facing screens and immersed in these digital worlds and oblivious to all this amazing activity that just is constantly unfolding around us, world that's bursting with life. So it's a fun way for me to kind of get re-immersed in that and remind myself that I too am part of that, and that I also have a strong tether to the earth, and it's helping me reconnect in a way that I think I and like many of us have kind of lost that.
For sure. And I was thinking about that in light of what you were saying, because if you remember in the guided meditation that I would lead in the expanding awareness class, one of the things we do is root ourselves into the earth and how much of a difference that makes. And you ideally don't just do it there in these meditation moments, but it changes your perspective. So you kind of have this walking meditation that you move through the world, being aware of this symbiotic relationship with the planet and all the species. And hopefully that does change how we think about things. And one of the things that's going to be happening in September is going to be offering these 2 classes. So people are interested in taking the expanding awareness class. That's going to be available starting in September. They can check out my essenceofbeing.info website. One of the things we were talking about a minute ago was the sense that we are connected to so much more than what we think of ourselves. And it's fractals all the way up and all the way down kind of thing. But that's absolutely true. And so we, I think, have to have this different relationship with each other, with the planet. And the only way to restore that relationship is to actually invest in it. So doing things like what you're doing with Invest and all is really helpful. But speaking of habits and ways, as you spoke about, of course, today we're going to get into this notion of demonology and how it's so insidiously inserted into ufology, how it seems to be ubiquitous. You can't be talking about UFOs and aliens, these other kinds of beings, without having people, especially in our American context, although it does happen around the world to some degree, inserting notions around these could be these spiritual figures that have been talked about for eons, basically, is what people assume anyway. So it's going to be interesting to dive into this one. There are many, many nuances to get to. I think that if ever there was a topic that was perfect for Liminal Frames, this is one. Not just because it's a topic with many, many nuances, but of course you and I both have a personal history, both in terms of being within Christian circles for decades and also having studied it in an academic context, understanding some of that shift between going from the sort of devotional frame week to week with communities to the sort of the academic framing, the historical critical method, those kind of things. So I'm looking forward to it. There's a lot to break down.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to this talk all week. I've been revisiting some history on demonology. It's a fascinating subject. Like you said, it kind of permeates ufology. You can't go too far, too long without bumping into it. You're going to find someone that is convinced that it's demons. And of course, we're all familiar, if you've been following this topic for some time, of this notion of the Collins elite that had this conviction that this was, we already know what this is. This is just demons. And I think if you've grown up in the West in the last, the 20th century, 21st century, we're immersed in kind of demonology in so many different ways and facets. It's captured the imagination of our entertainment media. You're going to find it kind of everywhere. And more stories are constantly being written and worlds are being built around this fight between good and evil, and the representatives of those good and evil worlds. You have God and angels and Satan and the devil and demons. These are these dramatic battles fighting over the future of humanity, essentially. And I mean, that's really good entertainment. And I think because it's entertaining, it captivates the imagination. It also plays to our deepest fears, our existential fears. All of these factors go into, the ufology mix and bring it to the forefront, because it's just part of our cultural milieu. Like, it's something we can't avoid. And so when you're thinking of bringing an archetypal concept, and applying that to what could UFOs be and what could the occupants be, well, you're going to go to one of these archetypes and say, yeah, this seems like it could fit really well. Like, it's not human, and it seems to be deceptive and tricking people. And so what also kind of checks similar boxes, and people then go, well, it's got to be demons. But I think what you and I want to do is really explore that a little bit more. And of course, the way that we often will explore topics, diving deep into the history of how we got some of these concepts, like, particularly within Christianity, and how embedded are the concepts in the Bible itself. And how have these ideas changed and morphed over time as communities of faith have wrestled not only with their beliefs, but wrestled with the cultures of their day that they find themselves in. So it's going to be really interesting. And obviously that process never ends. We do it today. We're doing it, as we speak.
Absolutely. There's so many different layers to this, and we'll be hard-pressed to get to all of them, and even all the ones we prepared, because there's so much to get into. But if I could give a practical example based on something you just said there that factors in here in a way that might not be obvious to people at first. So when I hear you say the French word milieu, right, with your American accent, you say milieu or something like that, right? Because you weren't exposed to French, right? I was exposed to some French when I was growing up. So there are certain ways that some people can structure their mouth in such a way they can produce certain sounds. Other people, it's more difficult. I remember this one guy from Australia trying to pronounce the names of some Spanish cities or some Mexican cities. Could not do it, right? Not even close. The point I'm making is that that's because early in your development and my development, we are exposed to certain speech sounds. What's fascinating there is that we are basically, from an evolutionary point of view, designed to land on the speech sounds that are part of our native language. We become experts at that language. But by definition, you therefore have to lose some of that breadth and depth so that you actually lose the ability to speak in the way that those other languages would speak in a native kind of tongue. And only young children can really do it where they have not sort of doubled down on one particular way of structuring their understanding of even what they can hear. So even gets to the point where you can play two different sounds for one kind of audience, and they will not hear the difference, whereas a native speaker will definitely hear the difference. The reason I bring this up is because much of this religious kind of thinking and framing is part of people's neurology while they're still forming, right? While they're still children. And so it becomes so embedded, so deeply embedded in the very way that they're actually developing as a human being, as a physiological organism, that to undo that is no small feat at all. And, you know, I remember Donald Hoffman, of course, now known as this really cutting-edge scientist, him saying that he basically still views himself, even in his late 60s, early 70s, whatever he is now, as a lifelong recovering fundamentalist, because he was raised in a fundamentalist family where he was taught that, you know, if you didn't see it this way, you're risking losing your soul for eternity. And so he talks about going to college and feeling called to study science, but a little bit of that fear, like, am I losing my soul in doing this, never fully goes away for a lot of people. So that's something to keep in mind as we proceed today, because people might say, that's just not logical. Why would people think that? But people underestimate the degree to which our cultural heritage, especially when it's happening from childhood on, becomes part of who we are. And it's a lot of work to undo that. So just want to remind people of that.
No, it's super important. And I was going to make a joke about if you ever had a partner that you spent any time with, you would realize that even if you grow up in the same culture, you have adopted particular ways of doing things, seeing the world, and those ways are going to be challenged when you decide to spend your life with someone else for some period of time. You're going to be like, wait a minute, you do it this way, and I thought everybody did it this other way. So then you kind of come into conflict with a different way of being in the world. That's why, you know, I really enjoy traveling. I think it exposes me to these different ways of being in the world and understanding it. I'm never going to be at a place where I can fully understand it as if I were a native of those places. But I certainly hope to be able to gain an appreciation for it. Even if I fully appreciate it, I'm still going to at some level be feeling a little bit awkward, like a little bit of fish out of water when I compare myself to how they may do certain things. So it's a reminder that this is just part of who we are. It's not something that we can really get rid of. And, we're going to come back to that idea, I think, throughout this conversation.
That's a great point. There's always a trade-off, right? I remember one person describing that as much as we sort of view a cosmopolitan, global kind of perspective as being ideal, that isn't to say you don't lose things in the process, right? So I've lived in 3 different countries and 2 different continents in my lifetime, and yet that gives me a really broad understanding, but I don't have the same kind of depth as someone who's lived in one land for their entire lives and have come from generations and generations of living in that land. That will always have a depth that's different than what I'm able to access. So it's a really good point. And we should remember that there is no perfect way or ideal way to exist in the world. To be human is to have some give and take, for sure. All right, so let's dive into this notion of demonology and why it's so intrinsically connected to the UFO phenomenon, especially in certain cultures more than others. Now, what I wanted to begin with was just some things I hear being said in our circles from people who have this perspective. This happens regularly. These are things I hear being said. And to the point we made earlier, even when we've literally countered these points in an episode, I'll still see sometimes afterwards people in the comments will say, well, it's probably just demons because of such and such, even though we just did try to sort of deconstruct some of that and where that's coming from. So this, again, just keeps coming up because, again, this stuff is much more embedded than people realize. All right, so let's think about this. First thing I hear being said is, quote, if they do evil things, they must be demons, right? So that's one thing that happens. So we've got some behavior patterns that, at least on the surface, look like people being abducted, kidnapped, whatever word you want to use. Seems like, from a Western conception, some human rights violations are going on. Therefore, they must be nefarious. Therefore, what do we know about any kind of beings that are not human that do nefarious things? Aha, demons fits the category, must be that. Thank you very much. That's the first one, right? Another one that comes up is, oh, they're in the sky? Well, we know this one passage that says Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. So you CE5 folks see a lot of these lights in the sky. You even encourage it, and then it shows up. You are being duped by this satanic deception, and you are risking your souls when this happens. So, of course, this is kind of a bit of circular reasoning. We don't have any clear evidence other than the fact that they are technically lights in the sky to assume it's Satan parading and trying to fool people. But this is the way this kind of thinking works, that you have circular reasoning, you have these few passages that are always interpreted in certain ways, other passages that never get brought up at all because they just sort of confound things. So what do you think about some of those really common phrases you hear people raise?
Yeah, those are good ones. The evil one is certainly good. They're anti kind of aligned against humanity, right? So what beings would be aligned against human interest? Well, I can't think of anything better than Satan and his minions, right? Like it's this imagery of beings that are out to kind of torture and torment and play with and abuse and take advantage of human beings. So to kind of also this notion of like steering us from a certain path, that we might want to do the right thing, but they're kind of the demon on your shoulder is sort of ask you to do something against your will or against your better nature. So I think that those are interesting concepts too. So definitely a good one. One thing that I thought about too that comes to mind, you often hear, like, think about the Virginia incident where the being was supposedly had kind of a sulfurous smell, so you think about sulfur, like that's another common connotation to demons. And so, there you go. There's another data point that says this has to be demons. And it had kind of knobby things on its head. Well, there's another data point that this could be demons. So, it kind of goes on and on. I totally get why people go there, because if you think about, again, these sort of archetypal ideas, like there's not much to choose from that they have to draw from, right? There's a very limited amount of archetypes to really go for. And these are the ones that are kind of like readily grabbable right at the surface.
Totally true. And one point that I want to make, just in case people are worried that we're going to try to paint this as all love and light, I don't think either one of us would say that negative experiences don't happen to people. They do. I would hope that by now people recognize that I keep lobbying for this spectrum kind of way of looking at these different kinds of life forms, that there's a really, really broad spectrum, and that this spectrum of consciousness development applies in all these different domains. And so you're going to have everything within there. And so there are some entities that are absolutely parasitic. The question, though, is which label best applies, and when is a label an after-the-fact sort of human construction that actually takes us further away from the empirical data, from the actual evidence itself, and just calling something a name doesn't necessarily get you any sort of qualitatively closer to understanding. And we sometimes make that mistake in a culture that's very referential. We think if we can assign some words to it, we somehow understand it, rather than realizing, as we've said many times before in this podcast, that all we're doing is trading our current relationship with these ideas for a human being's relationship with these ideas and taking the terms that they came up with, rather than dealing with it in real time, which takes a certain kind of courage and involves us stepping up to the plate and say, we have as much a role as anybody in history to really reckon with this. So that's something to be aware of as well. Okay, so the themes can be dark, foreboding, and scary. So again, that sounds like demons. Now, without being facetious here, to me that's like saying, okay, it walks on four legs, it's furry, then all cats are actually dogs. Like, we know that doesn't actually work, but that's kind of what happens here, especially if we're really doubled down in this notion that, like you said, anything that fits these kind of criteria must be a demon, right? I think the red glowing eyes is another one, right, that sort of fit in that kind of category. All right, another one. This one comes up a lot, and I admit this one is tricky to deal with because it goes against our physicalist sort of modern conceptions of what even exists and what's part of a human being, and that is that there's notions of these beings taking people and then doing things with their souls, or even experimenting with human souls, these kinds of things, even ideas around duplicating the bodies of certain human beings. But then there's the question of, does the soul come with it? I'm very familiar with many people, many close friends of mine who have been part of the abduction phenomenon. Sometimes their body's taken, sometimes just their consciousness is taken. You might call that a soul. What is the soul, right? These are questions, again, embedded with all sorts of fractals of cultural context that have changed over time. But when you think about that one, how does that ring true in terms of that's immediately going to set off certain triggers for people when they hear that souls are being played with?
Well, 100%. I mean, particularly if you don't have any other taxonomy or nomenclature to use to explain that experience, right? If what you've been told, your inner life, your essence of who you are, essentially your consciousness is your soul, like that's exactly what you're going to think if you have an experience that you all of a sudden find your awareness not embodied, you find your awareness somewhere else. It's left your body. It's in in an astral place or whatnot. It's being extracted from your body. So what else would it be other than your soul? And when we're then talking about souls, we're talking about these sort of large concepts of fighting for your salvation, eternal good or eternal damnation. There's this war at play. And then it comes down to choices, like, well, did I make the right choice or make the wrong choice? And, too, I often think of people who talk about accounts where they call upon the name of Jesus, right? And all of a sudden the tormenting has stopped. And so, well, why wouldn't they be demons? Because then they heard Jesus's name and they got, freaked out. They don't want to deal with that. So they exit the picture all of a sudden. So it seems like it checks a lot of the boxes that it could be demons. So it's a comfortable explanation. But like you say, if you kind of dig a little bit further on it, you start realizing that maybe this is not as clear-cut as it might seem. But certainly with the soul situation, I understand why people go there. Because we're only recently kind of adopting language that gets us thinking about our conscious awareness and how it might be something separate from the body, et cetera.
Another thing that comes to mind here is the notion that some of what we're dealing with, because again, it's a plethora of things we're dealing with, but one of them I'm pretty convinced is part of the picture is a hyper-advanced future AI. So if you think about how we're trying to train our sort of first, second generation AI systems, we are trying to give it data so it can understand things and regurgitate things about our reality. It makes sense that at some point, no matter how much data you give it, it's going to be perplexed about the nature of the soul, because this is something that's kind of ineffable, right? It's a part of reality that we can't just feed it data to comprehend. So it's not too much of a surprise to imagine that a future hyper-advanced AI might be particularly interested in these metaphysical matters and might be actually trying to understand what the soul is. And if this comes from beyond space-time in the most sort of transcendent kind of way, then it's going to be really perplexed by this, because it might be only working with the tools within space-time, or it might have more than that. The point is that there are actually interesting research questions around these notions, and AI might eventually get to those. So that's something to be aware of too. I also want to point out, just for the people who get nervous even hearing this, that in every single case I'm aware of, that someone had their consciousness taken, it was also returned to their body. Which isn't to say we don't hear some cases of like the 411 kind of cases of people that seem to disappear in national parks. Again, we're not trying to paint this as all love and light any more than I would say to a 5-year-old, please feel free, leave the house, walk around the city as much as you want. No harm could ever come to you. Like, we of course wouldn't say that. I think we would want to be cautious in the same way about these different kinds of realms. Same sort of spectrum, same sort of questions. And what we're really arguing for is complexity, nuance, rather than simplistic two-bucket answers kind of thing. Right, another one that comes to mind, and I know you'll have thoughts about this, I do too, because this is a big part of it, where you get an idea and an assumption that is attached to that idea. So one thing you hear people saying is that if portions of the U.S. government, even significant portions of the U.S. government believe this, their view must be grounded in data and evidence. So you hear that a lot. You just hear this suggestion that somehow government people are not people. They don't have histories. They don't have worldviews. They've taken with them into those positions, and so they are grounded in science and objectivity. So if they're believing this, they must be seeing evidence that makes this clear. So what would you say to someone who makes that argument?
Yeah, well, this most recently was talked about by Lou Elizondo. He's given these examples a couple of times. One example where he's talking to somebody at the Pentagon and they say, well, have you read your Bible? So they're alluding to the fact that like this is part of kind of the Christian mythology that it says. And then the other example was they were walking in the hallway and somebody said, we don't know what you're looking at, and we already know what it is, and it's it's all demons. So just don't bother looking at it. So it's kind of it's interesting to me because, so one, absolutely true. They're human beings, and people who are in the Pentagon, in these operations, in these agencies, are human beings just like you and I. They have cultural backgrounds, they have worldviews that they have adopted. Even if they've gained more information or insight into the inner workings of our society, they're still bringing their whole self to the job. And sometimes they try to be more objective and kind of put some of that self on the shelf and try to not to let it get in the way. But when it comes to matters of complexity that exceed the bounds of which we can normally understand, where are they going to go for rational explanations? They're kind of more likely to go to the easy to grab explanations that they were taught at a very young age. And if you grew up in the U.S. and you can think about mythologies, like you're taught the sort of Christian mythology, and so it's absolutely easy for them just to kind of grab that out and go, this is what it is. And that you think about it further, it's an easy way to dismiss it as well, kind of hand wave it away. Like by giving it a simple label that this is demons, like think about all the baggage that goes along with that makes you kind of, it's like, I don't want to touch that. I don't want to touch demons. It's hot. It's dangerous. Let's not even look at it. Let's stop the investigation, everybody, because I don't want to be responsible for demons getting unleashed, on the American public. And, you've even heard stories about people who've talked about CERN and what the work that they're doing, unleashing portals into these other worlds, specifically being kind of this nether world, this demonic realm, and letting demons invade the earthly realm. So yeah, it's a fascinating take, and I think it makes sense that a lot of maybe kind of senior people would have this perspective, because that's certainly what they were brought up in. I know in the last several decades, the amount of people who go to church has dropped pretty dramatically, but you think about 50, 60, 70 years ago, I mean, most people did go to church and have a worldview that included this kind of conception. So if those folks are now, in authority, then of course they're going to carry that worldview with them in those positions.
That's right. And what I would also want to remind people of here is that this is going to be a very different conversation for two groups of people. People who are never really in these kind of circles will find it quite difficult to relate to. They will have a hard time understanding why people couldn't just sort of see the facts, quote unquote, and eventually outgrow these notions. And then there are people who've been within these traditions who will fully understand how difficult it is to separate yourself, especially when this was part of your formative kind of foundation as a human being. And I think here of a notion like the Manchurian Candidate, where a certain kind of programming kicks in under certain circumstances, right? So say if you're brought up in the church and you're brought up to believe that ultimately this is a battle between good and evil. We do things as human beings. We collect cars and houses, but ultimately, underlyingly, what's going on is a battle for good and evil, the future of human souls, that kind of thing, and the destiny of the universe. So you go through your life. That's kind of something you hear on Sundays. You don't think too much about it. You think if you live a pretty good life and say the right prayers, you'll go to heaven when you die. Then suddenly, in your professional work, you come across what seems like entities of a non-traditional nature that seem to be coming in from some other domain and doing some things that at least look complex, perhaps even nefarious, hard to tell, because, again, how do you understand the actions of a non-human intelligence? And so what happens is something kicks in that suddenly makes you color it a certain way, and you don't even have that much conscious control over that happening because the programming is so deeply seated kind of thing. And like you pointed to, and again, those not brought up in these traditions might have a hard time understanding this, but Elizondo has spoken to this directly, David Greff to some degree too, that for these people to even entertain these questions is to dance with the devil. It's not just you look into it, you do really robust research, go, sure enough, it's Satan and his minions, let's back up everybody. No, it's to even begin to look into this somehow opens the doorway further for this flood of evil to come into the world. And so, again, as we've discussed before with the Collins elite, a lot of people think this happened with Jack Parsons, even going back to Aleister Crowley, a lot of notions about when this happened. A lot of people in these circles literally believe the modern UFO phenomenon is actually a satanic deception. And of course, when they have certain notions of the way the world should be, that's based on, like you said, what they grew up with in the 1950s or whatever, and they look at the world today that's very discombobulating for them, they're going to say, sure enough, it looks like a satanic deception slowly is corrupting the world. So you get all these kind of secondary factors that compound the original understanding. So this is how tricky it is, right? The people that are in government are coming from the same upbringings as everybody else. And this is deeply seated in American culture. Even right now, we have one political party that is openly saying things sometimes to the effect of church versus state was really misinterpreted, that we actually are a Christian nation. Is that much different from Sharia law in some Islamic countries? Really not, right? But again, it's not seen that way because they don't have the perspective to see that. They're embedded within one particular worldview, and that frames everything. So this is kind of what we're up against. To this point, we both talked about this a bit. Let's riff on this a bit. There's an event that happened recently, the Paris Olympics, that speaks to this very notion, right? That you have these certain buckets that you assume describe reality accurately. And then you see something happen and you assume that it means one thing. And you get this sort of outrage that rises up because of this. So ironically, again, because this skews your entire way that you see the world, you get a lot of people who are coming from a conservative point of view religiously who are convinced there's a modern war against Christianity. Even though, as far as I know, every American president in the history of our country was declared as a Christian, and yet they still somehow are convinced that there's a war against Christianity. Now, often that's a cultural Christianity that means more their conception of what 1950s Americana was. But let me just read a quick excerpt from an article here that talked about what happened with this Paris Olympics fiasco. This is from The Conversation. Quote, many viewers, including Pope Francis and Ayatollah Khomeini, interpreted the scene as a parody mocking Leonardo da Vinci's painting of the Last Supper, circa 1495. By extension, they claimed that the opening ceremony mocked the Last Supper, the event Christians believe instituted the Eucharist celebration, and Christianity itself. The outrage has been so intense in some quarters that the ceremony organizers have been subject to death threats. These responses fundamentally misinterpret the scene, which was not supposed to reference the Last Supper at all. The director of the ceremony, Thomas Joly, was principally inspired not by Da Vinci's The Last Supper, but by La Festin de Dieu, speaking of that French pronunciation again, The Feast of God, circa 1635 to 1640, a painting by Jean van Billet, probably getting that wrong. This painting depicts the marriage of the characters from ancient Greek mythology, which we'll get into later. Anyway, on it goes. Basically, a misapplication here of the context. And not just a misapplication, but outrage, even to the point of death threats as a result. What do you make of all that?
I mean, absolutely true. They started off the ceremony with a heavy metal shooting flames in the sky and, headless damsels in windows. I mean, it's satanic everywhere. It's all over the place. You have to realize these are ingrained conceptions in the U.S. kind of psyche. When you're seeing things like this, that you're going to naturally gravitate to those kinds of interpretations. You add to that the fact that there's been a concerted effort over many, many decades in Protestant Christianity in the United States to demonize the Catholic Church, right? And anything that has any kind of sort of potential tie into Catholicism, even if it's making a mockery of Catholicism, which, again, wrongly interpreted in this situation, but some people may have taken that angle, it's also going to be connotated with the devil. Basically, many people look at the Pope as kind of this antichrist type of figure that's presiding over not a real, genuine Christianity, not the true church. So you have a country like France that is, historically Catholic. You got this situation where they're putting on this show, and if you're American, you don't understand the language, you don't understand the symbology. You have a very, very shallow sort of pool of understanding in terms of art history, of ancient history, of interpretive history, all these different factors. And so you're just looking at this, plunged yourself into this environment, and what else would you think? This looks just human, everything. It's not. This doesn't seem godly. Where are the angels? I saw somebody even talk about there was like one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, at this opening ceremony. So you jump to these places, these scary places where they're, I can see people like grabbing their Bibles off their shelves and flipping frantically to the pages of the book of Revelation and going, look, right here, see, this is what it's talking about. It's this very same thing, and it's happening on my TV right now. And so therefore we must be in the end time. So it can really kind of whip itself up into a frenzy very easily. And I just found it kind of funny that the French are just like, what do you mean? Like, why are you taking this interpretation? It's not what we meant at all. But then the U.S. conspiratorialists would be like, well, of course that's what you'd tell us. We know that it's still a satanic cabal that's running the world, and you would tell us that it's not what we thought it was. But we're on to you. We know better.
Exactly. And the ignorance kind of works both ways because, again, on the American side, it's the assumption that they think like we do. But on the flip side of that, though, Europe is very post-Christian. Europe is very secular. That's problematic, by the way. We're not just critiquing our own country here. There are problems in Europe. I'm aware of people who have had anomalous experiences in Europe. They really run into more problems there than they do here because it's so not accepted there. People have been institutionalized because of experiences they've had. People that I know I would describe as being hybrid in nature that get institutionalized because they can see more than the average person. And that doesn't get lumped into witchcraft anymore in Europe. It gets lumped into mental illness. So no simple solutions here. And it is tricky on top of that because part of the irony here is that I really do believe, ironically, after us saying all of this, that we are at a very particular moment in human history that feels like some sort of apex moment. And I think what I've been talking about on Event Horizon that we've discussed as well, all these simultaneously occurring events that seem to be spiraling up, the singularity, right, that's talked about in some circles and religious circles as the end times or the apocalypse or whatever. These all might be referring to the same thing. So we're not saying there isn't hints of these ancient traditions tapping into something because, again, reality is not linear. There are ways you can perceive the future. So we're not even critiquing these ancient apocalyptic texts and saying they're always wrong or there's nothing to this. There is something to this. In fact, people even today are taken aback by how much they sense something is coming. Not all that different from someone who might sit down and pen an apocalyptic text, right? So this is complex. We're just saying that we need to keep the aperture open, hold open as many buckets as possible, because the problem is not just a poverty of imagination, but it's a poverty of historical understanding and context. So like you say, Americans misunderstanding Europeans totally being oblivious to how this is going to be cast in an American context, knowing that the Olympics are for the world, but they don't think about that, not because they're trying to be cruel towards Americans or anti-Americans. Somehow they're just ignorant. That's what it comes down to, just as Americans are ignorant of some of these other ways of something that might look like the Last Supper, which is not that at all. So tricky stuff, for sure. All right, now one thing I wanted to get into a little bit before we get into the history of demonology, because again, this is a really fascinating topic. This could be a multi-year course program, basically, because it's wrapped up in history and it's wrapped up in things that are real, but we're getting back to those questions around what came first, right? We have in the ancient biblical tradition, in the Jewish texts, notions of what seem like NHI, having sexual relations with human beings, with women, and hybrid beings being created. So some people might say, well, this is clearly part of the Bible. And we would just say, well, no, the Bible was written as part of human history. But how you frame it is determined by cultural context and those kinds of things. So we see some of those very same things happening. I know people personally who've had babies taken, who've had ova taken, who've encountered these hybrid children. Many, many people, more than I think people would be aware of, for sure. And it is pretty mind-blowing when you start thinking this might be some of the same things that were happening in ancient history that we assume is just from a bygone era that would never happen again. The other thing I want to touch on really briefly is how Scripture, which is to say the way that we frame these realities, forms over time. Because again, in very conservative circles, there's this assumption, there's this one-to-one, well, God inspired it, and then it just appeared on the page, and it's beautiful. Actually, what happens is it's a very long, drawn-out process that goes through numerous steps. So first you have oral traditions. Now, we're used to being able to be in front of computers, let alone paper, and we can type things down the second we think about them. We have phones, we could dictate into our phones, we make ourselves a little note. That was not the case in the ancient past. So most of these notions were passed on orally over time, over generations. Now, here's where anachronism comes in, because some people might say, well, I've played the telephone game. That's dangerous. It changes by the time you get to the 12th person down the line. Surely they wouldn't put up with that. They would understand how much that would bias the result. But again, they didn't think like that. That was not their mindset. So this is another one of the assumptions we make, that people have always thought the same way about the world. That's just not true. So eventually that oral tradition, after generations sometimes, finally gets written down. But even then, it's often written down with a certain agenda in mind. So for instance, you have notions of genre here. So the Gospels that people are familiar with in the New Testament, that's actually a genre. It's not just a term to describe those books. It's actually a genre, meaning it has a very specific agenda. When we talk about evangelizing people, which is what evangelical comes from, it's the notion of presenting in such a way that it would be enticing for you to want to join, right? It's basically like marketing material in some ways, you could argue. So that's what we're going with here. And again, people, when they even try to read the Bible, they assume it's just one kind of text all the way through. And what we're actually seeing is a very, very complex compendium of human history across genres and everything else.
Yeah, and I want to come back to something you said earlier, and this conversation is going to be perceived differently by different groups of people. And I recognize how difficult that is, that there are some folks that just after listening to what you said are immediately shutting their ears off and thinking like, well, I'm sorry, Darren's just wrong here. Like, the Bible is divinely inspired. It is infallible. It's I can read it in a literal way, and it's exactly what it says. And there's no other way to interpret it than what's on the page. And then there are other folks who have none of that perspective at all. They didn't grow up with any kind of biblical literacy. So all this stuff sounds like kind of a waste of time to even talk about. And you have a middle ground number of folks who weren't exposed to kind of a literalist perspective or a fundamentalist perspective on this text, have a much more nuanced perspective on the text, and are okay with the fact that, yes, maybe there are some little things, maybe there are some metaphorical things. Yes, it was written by human beings. Yes, interpretations change over time. I can still believe in this overarching sort of story with a lot of a different kind of wiggle room to work with in terms of how the text is interpreted. So it makes this extra challenging for us to kind of talk about this without, I think, stepping on some toes, because this is literally, in many cases, a sacred cow for folks, right? So, definitely a challenge there, but 100% true that, if, at least from my perspective, and if you just think about it from a current perspective, if I were to write Darren a letter today, and he were to keep it and put it in a lockbox, and 100 years from now, or 200 years from now, somebody takes out the letter and looks at this, artifact from ancient past, and they would read it, and they would read it with the language that they have of that time. Some of the words are going to be a little bit different. The slang is going to be a little bit different. Our idioms are going to be a little bit different. And so the interpretation that they have in the future of this letter I wrote to Darren is going to be quite different than maybe what I fully intended it to be. And well, let's discard the fact that even Darren and I have a shared history that's not going to be recorded in the letter itself, right? There's context to that conversation, just like there's context to conversations I have with my friends, colleagues, etc., that isn't spoken. It's unspoken context that is a part of. It's basically a presence in the room, if you will, as part of that story, and it affects the interpretation of how that story unfolds. So it's incredibly complicated to sort of take a very one-dimensional view of this text and say, well, see, this word in the Old Testament, it's exactly the same word as it is over here in the New Testament. Satan is Satan. The demon is a demon. And what is a demon? Well, it's this, archetypal thing. I can tell you it's got horns and this, that, or the other. What does it actually say? And what did the original text say? And what did people think about those kinds of figures around the time period that book was written? These are all important questions that we need to take into consideration to get a more fulsome picture of what's really happening in this material.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're treading some interesting ground here, because we are arguing for so much nuance, and we're saying that any of these pre-existing buckets that have existed really are not sufficient to do justice to this. Because what we were saying is that actually some of these ancient texts were recording actual accounts of encounters with non-human intelligence that might have been called gods back then, but even the term God, small g God, right, was obviously another term that's being used in the Hebrew, didn't mean what we mean it to mean today. And even today, what we mean by God is very different in a tradition like Hinduism that imagines many, many different kinds of deities versus a monotheistic tradition like Judaism, Islam, Christianity, which assumes there's one capital G God and everybody else is basically probably a demon. We're going to get into why that's the case too historically. So what I found is that sometimes I'll get some people who might be offended that they think I'm taking their Christianity and trying to turn it into ufology. And on the other hand, I get some people who say, I think you went too far here. Like, these are just a bunch of made-up stories. Why you bring that into ufology? And I think both of those are insufficient and don't do justice to what's going on. These accounts are real to some degree, right, with cultural filters, all that in there, of course. But that begs the question, what really is going on here? And that's the very same questions we're wrestling with today. But it's definitely not, I think, correct to say that these stories are just made up for people who were pre-scientific and wanted to come up with some idea they could teach their children of why, the crops burned down or something. That's much too simplistic.
Yeah, if we're not stepping on toes with this, then we're not doing our job right. So everyone should be a little bit offended by, I think, the way that we're pushing this here, because, for some folks, they look at this text, and we're kind of harping on the Bible because it's something that we're most familiar with, and I think is something that relates most closely to this particular topic. But for many people, the Bible was written and literally is a closed story. There's no additional sort of activity happening that is divinely inspired in the world. It sort of happened already. It's the story of God and the story of Jesus, and boom, it's this neat little thing. I can hand it to you, and there it is. It's done, basically. I'm just trying to kind of get back to it or better understand it or live the principles of this story in my own life. But we ignore, I think, to our detriment, the fact that this is an ongoing story. Like, the story never stops, right? So we have to be willing to look at this ancient material, whether it be the Bible or any other human account wrestling with these ultimate questions. We have to be willing to look at this material and look at it from the perspective that it's part of our story. That story is continuing and evolving, and we cannot discard elements of it outright just because we think we now have the corner on the market of truth. That is, the hubris that is implied with that statement is out of control, and it's just wrong. We need to be willing to sort of hold all of these things together and hold them in suspension and say, you know what, this is all part of what's going on here. And if I step back and look at it from a broader perspective, I may begin to actually see the actual picture. But, we've zoomed in so far onto this thing that I think we lose sight of really the large scope of the story itself.
It's a great point. And to that end, I remember Bernardo Kastrup talking about one day, a couple centuries, or maybe even 50 years from now, people will look back at this physicalist-centric era and almost make a mockery of it, because to him it's so clear that this is a divergence that's taking us away from truth and the ultimate reality of things. So much so that one day he thinks people will look back and say those same kind of things that we say about these pre-scientific societies. How could they possibly have ever believed those kinds of things? And like you say, the way hubris works in human history is we always assume that our contemporary era is somehow immune to these things. We finally landed at truth and everybody else got it wrong. Absolutely true. All right, to that point, now what I'd like us to do is sort of walk through how this notion of demonology has evolved over time, because that's what you just pointed to, that when you read something like the Bible, it almost sounds even funny saying that, because that's a really complex mixture of genres, books, cultures, traditions over a vast history of humankind, where you actually, if you look closely, especially if you can study in the original languages, which I got a chance to do in college, you can literally see the evolution of some of these concepts, where what they began meaning is very different than what they ended up meaning. And you, of course, later on see certain Christian theologians co-opting some of these earlier things and tweaking them and saying, let's just say it meant this. Even if it's very clear from an objective point of view, that's not really a fair viewing of that earlier text. They will do it so that the current view seems more well-supported and more historical, and it's always been that way. because we don't like the idea of evolution, actually. We like to believe that things are a certain way, they've always been that way. And we even see this kind of bias in science, right? So anthropology, archaeology, these kinds of things tend to argue for incrementalism, this idea that things are just slowly changing and they've always pretty much been the way they are. So that leads us to conclusions like there were no ancient civilizations prior to modern humanity, that prehistory was just about dinosaurs and things like that. No sophisticated kingdoms were on the earth, even when we see evidence with some of these monolithic structures that don't play well with that notion. But again, it really comes down to hubris. So it's going to be so fascinating for all of us in the remarkable times we're living in to continue to see this topic be grounded in reality, because what it's reintroducing to our modern society is all of the same questions these beings were wrestling with. And they ended up going to war over their different notions of what these beings were. They would align so much with one particular non-human intelligence that they would assume or be convinced by that non-human intelligence that the neighboring tribe should be exterminated, eradicated, right? There are some horrifying parts of ancient scripture as well, where basically what we see is almost like the willing of genocide, and it's being sanctioned by a god. Now, I don't want to get too off the rails here, but some of the research I've done suggests that I think even some of our more recent history where certain people groups are targeted and we see genocide happen might actually be being influenced by nefarious non-human intelligence that knows certain things about those people groups that makes them want them to not be on the face of the earth, literally. So as much as that will sound like a stretch to some people, I would just say, go back and read ancient scripture, see what happens there. And why would those people have those perspectives? Where are these notions being seeded from to begin with? So really consequential matters to get into. All right, let's start with what influenced what eventually became Christian demonology. So first we have the influence of pre-Christian traditions. This begins with the ancient Near East. So the earliest roots of demonology in Christian thought can be traced back to the ancient Near East, particularly in Mesopotamia and Canaanite regions. In these traditions, demons were often malevolent spirits associated with disease, chaos, and death. Here again, we're getting to the way that humans conceive of things. The Hebrew Bible, known as the Old Testament in Christian circles, reflects some of these influences, with mentions of malevolent spirits in Leviticus 17:7 and Isaiah 13:21. Then we get into Zoroastrianism. Now, as I say this, I know that some people that come from Christian backgrounds are going to be triggered by some of this because they have assumed, of course, because they've been taught this, I can't blame them, that their tradition owned all of this. The notion that these traditions were actually inherited from even older traditions rubs some people the wrong way, but that's just the way human history works. So with Zoroastrianism, we have a Persian religion that depicted a cosmic struggle between the forces of good and evil. Zoroastrianism introduced the idea of a dualistic universe where evil spirits or devas played a role in opposing divine order, which would later influence Christian ideas of demonic forces.
Well, yeah, I mean, dualism, of course, has left its mark and continues to leave its mark on current religious conceptions. And I think it's important to remind folks that, as you just pointed out, that it's not always been the case, that dualism hasn't always been the guiding sort of metaphysical perspective of these people throughout history. It's kind of been absorbed. It maybe kind of won out through competition in many ways. And if you think about the world, the ancient world, this sort of clash of empires, this you have trading with all these different kinds of peoples. It's in many ways there's a rich sort of life going on with all these different cultures kind of running into each other. But sometimes, as you pointed out, alluded to, these religious groups of people, these individuals or tribes, and they get persecuted, they get captured, they get subjugated, they get enslaved. They become a people that really don't have agency over their own future. And when you're a people like that, and the Jewish people have a long history of this, of persecution, when you're people like that, then, adopting a kind of dualistic narrative is very attractive. That there's this ultimate, at the end of time, this ultimate sort of situation, your side will prevail against these forces that right now in this moment seem insurmountable. Like we're we have no power now. We can't do anything. And so how are we going to kind of have hope for the future? Well, we're going to put our hope in in goodness, in our God that will ultimately prevail against this evil, this other that isn't us. So, and I think it's a very powerful way of looking at the world, but it hasn't always been the case. And in many cases, like these beings that we now are talking about as demons, they weren't necessarily viewed one-dimensionally, just in that purely like dualistic perspective, good or evil. They were kind of viewed more so like sometimes they could help you, sometimes they could hurt you, but they're not like inherently one or the other. And many people would, in fact, call upon some of these beings to, for various purposes, whether they be for healing or other types of intervention in human affairs, recognizing that, yes, sometimes they might intervene, but other times they might not care at all. In fact, might try to do the opposite and help in helping us.
Absolutely true. And you've often heard me describe how sometimes I feel like I'm being directed or animated by this larger move in consciousness. Now, interestingly, Bernardo Kastrup, who we've mentioned many times, he actually claims that a daemon is actually animating him and encouraging him to take certain steps. I know that he recently penned an autobiography, and it went a bit more personal than he would prefer, but he said, not ironically, that his daemon demanded it, right? So he listened. So he's talked about having this kind of relational dynamic with this, again, fractal, right, that supersedes his small self that he's influenced by. But there's still a kind of relational dynamic there. But for him, daemon is a term that is apt. I might say a larger move in consciousness or these fractal aspects of consciousness. But this is a notion that's not dead today. People still sometimes frame things this way. And to the point you made, I think when you are brought up in America or North America in general or parts of Europe, even though it's post-Christian in many ways, you're coming from a monotheistic background. There's certain assumptions about dualism are baked into the culture. But what we saw in the 20th century was for the first time people from Asia, that we referred to as the Orient back then, coming over for the first time, Zen masters, people from some of these Eastern cosmology traditions coming over and beginning to talk about this notion of non-duality. What in the world is that? It's a very, very different way of looking at the very fabric of reality itself. And that was, of course, as I've said many times, has been a big part of my background and my history. Now, if I was born 3 centuries ago, where I didn't have the advantage of being able to travel and those people had not come across from those parts of the world, I would never perhaps be exposed to those notions. So this just tells us how much of our views of the world, even what we're willing to entertain, is determined by the context we're in, what part of the world we're in, what era we're born into, those kinds of things. So really important to remember that monotheism is baked into huge parts of the world, but it has not always been that way. And even today, in some parts of the world, it's not seen that way whatsoever. The next era that we're going to explore is the Second Temple period within Jewish tradition. So during the Second Temple period, which was from 516 BCE to 70 CE, Jewish thought developed a more elaborate demonology. Texts such as the Book of Enoch, non-canonical in most Christian traditions, very often cited in ufology, by the way, describe the fall of angels and their transformation into demons known as the Watchers, again, a group often referred to in ufology. These fallen angels were believed to have corrupted humanity and were punished by God, a concept that would later be integrated into Christian demonology. Then we have Satan's role. This refers to something I alluded to earlier. In Jewish thought, Satan began as an adversarial figure rather than an embodiment of evil. He was actually a member of the council of the Godhead. Over time, Satan's role expanded and he became associated with the leader of demonic forces, particularly in the context of the apocalyptic literature of the period. And I would just emphasize again, this dovetails entirely with dualism. When you want to paint everything in these black and white kind of frames, then you need one champion of the dark side, and so that becomes Satan, even though, again, that figure that is even referred to by different names, not necessarily even the same figure whatsoever until later on, you see an evolution for sure. Then we have early Christianity. So you look at things like Jesus and exorcism. In the New Testament, Jesus is portrayed as having authority over demons, frequently performing exorcisms. Demons in this context are seen as malevolent spirits that possess individuals, causing physical and mental afflictions. These demons are often associated with Satan, who is seen as their leader. Then we have the Pauline epistles. The Apostle Paul further develops the concept of spiritual warfare, which we also hear a lot about in ufology, depicting the Christian life as a struggle against, quote, the rulers, authorities, and powers of the dark world. This is Ephesians 6:12. Again, if that's your perspective, you see these beings coming in and doing things, it's very easy to paint it with that kind of perspective. This language echoes earlier Christian apocalyptic thought and solidifies the idea of demons as part of a classic cosmic battle between good and evil. So before we go into the next one, some thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I want to kind of insert here into that explanation that early Christians, they're operating within a world that is populated and culturally defined by Hellenistic Greek mythology, and so you have this rich sort of tapestry of gods and goddesses and demigods, etc. It's a very rich mythology that just kind of permeates that particular landscape. And when you're talking about a belief in a one true God, a monotheistic God, Jesus being that same kind of one and the same, identify the revelation of that God, you've got this perfect sort of foil against that theological perspective. So that you have this. What is the foil? The foil is this, the pantheon here of gods and goddesses that you find kind of around every street corner. There are temples erected everywhere to the different gods and goddesses. There are ritualistic practices that are devoted to these gods and goddesses. And so, if you're kind of starting to set yourself apart, and if you're in the process of building a community that is focused on a monotheistic perspective, you've got these excellent sort of antithetical objects and beings and forces that you can set yourself up against. And so what often took place is that this sort of instead of calling them gods and goddesses, right? You can't even use that nomenclature. You can't call them gods and goddesses. So we're going to call them demons. We're basically going to overlay onto them. Zeus is a demon, Athena is a demon, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They're all are part of this demonic, anti-God, anti-Christ sort of force, and it's just a ready-made kind of story that you can adopt. It's right there waiting for you to make use of. You don't have to invent it; it's just right there, right? So it does make sense to me that the early church, fathers and founders and these early church communities, like they're going to use that and kind of reframe it in a way that only buttresses the theology that they're trying to get going, the movement that they're trying to push forward.
Absolutely, and this is why we can't separate human history from some of these notions, because as we all know, history is written by the victors. So when you have Christianity, which began as this underground movement, these house churches that had to be totally under the radar because they would be persecuted. Then they had this huge turn of events where they became the official religion of the empire. Then you have the empire spreading. They have to figure out not just how to conquer these peoples, but how to win the quote-unquote hearts and minds of these people. And the way you do that is by taking some of their traditions that exist that they found they couldn't kill easily. They couldn't just go in and say, turns out you were wrong, this is the way you should think about things now. That doesn't work. So instead what you do is you say, okay, I know you believe this, but this is actually this. So you try to do this bait and switch thing. So this can't be separated from, socioeconomic kind of cultural trends over time. Right, so we're going to get into the next phase now. And again, this speaks to what you mentioned earlier, Nathan, around the fact that the history has never stopped. We are always forming our models. We're always evolving our models. And the model that we're most embedded in now is usually the one we see the least. So next we have the patristic and medieval Christianity. So the church fathers, like Augustine of Hippo and Origen, elaborated on the nature of demons. Augustine in particular linked demons to the fallen angels of Genesis 6, again, only after the fact, aligning with the earlier Jewish traditions. He also emphasized demons as tempters who lead humans into sin, a view that became central to Christian demonology. Then you have the medieval periods. We're marching on in history here. During the medieval period, demonology became more systematized. Sounds like a very medieval kind of enterprise. Theologians like Thomas Aquinas further developed ideas about the nature of demons, their hierarchy, and their influence on the world. the medieval period also saw an increase in belief in witchcraft and demonic possession, leading to the witch hunts of the late medieval and early modern periods. Let me just jump ahead so we can get to this in the interest of time. The Reformation and modern Christianity, and then we're going to get into the co-opting of earlier traditions. So again, marching on in history here, on it goes. Protestant reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin retained traditional views on demons, but also emphasized the importance of personal piety and faith in combating demonic influence. The belief in demonic forces persisted, but the focus shifted towards individual responsibility and the role of the church in spiritual warfare. So again, imagine you're a person in government, you're one of the Collins elite. You think it's your responsibility, not just for your sake, but for the sake of the entire community, to resist these things. You think you're doing spiritual warfare. Then we have the Enlightenment and modernity moving even further in human history. With the rise of rationalism during the Enlightenment, belief in demons declined, especially in more liberal Christian denominations. However, in more conservative and charismatic branches of Christianity, belief in demons and exorcism remained strong. Modern Christian demonology often blends traditional beliefs and contemporary concerns, such as the association of demons with psychological and social issues. So this is an interesting point. I'm going to hand it over to you in a second here, but here's an example where, from a conservative Christian point of view, this is about possession and oppression by demons sometimes. Whereas from a modern secular view, this is just people suffering from mental illness. And again, I would say it's even more complex than that, because as I pointed out earlier, I have friends and people I know who have been institutionalized because they actually do tune into other realities, this broader bandwidth of reality, which as a consequence does make it more difficult to ground into this reality. And that means sometimes there's no simple answers. Sometimes medication is the safest way to ensure they can feel grounded enough to function in this world. But that's not because they are hallucinating things that aren't real. They actually are tuning into things. But they find they have to sort of find this middle ground to be grounded enough into this world. And one of the things we talk about in my classes is how do you do that? How do you begin to practice those kinds of things? Because I think this is going to increase over time. And I think this is why we're seeing a rise in anxiety and these kinds of things that show up in the mental health spectrum. So this is an example, again, of how these different buckets look at these same phenomena but call them different things.
This is, for me, like where modern demology really takes shape. You know, the sort of storyline that you just gave there. It's to use a kind of analogy, it's like we found a box of bones and we don't really know what the creature is. We're going to start assembling these bones to look like a creature, and over time, we then think like that's exactly what the creature was. So you've got these great examples of that in like paleontological, attempts. They've tried to put this dinosaur together, and it looks nothing at all like what it should look like. And but everybody thinks like, yeah, that's definitely what that dinosaur looked like. And that's kind of what we have now. Is it's sort of we've started to add this flesh and bone and muscle and tissue to these demons to kind of make them more detailed, more lifelike, more specific. We like kind of getting our arms around it by naming things and kind of mastering it that way. And so, you can see that progression has very much taken place. And then alongside that, as you kind of move forward into the modern time, I was thinking about the fact that these, our culture sort of globally generally has moved away from sort of more lawless, random events that happen. Here I'm thinking of, you don't know when the neighboring, group of people decides to come raid your village or whatever. You don't know when a pestilence is going to come and wipe out your entire town. Like these were things that just kind of were part and parcel to daily life for many, many, many generations. And as we enter into the Enlightenment and as rationalism starts to take hold, we see the quality of life begin to improve, people starting to live longer, governments and states starting to become more solid and staid. And so as that happens, you start becoming a lot less concerned with these sort of random, scary forces that are beyond your control. I mean, what personifies a random, scary force that is beyond your control better than a demon? And so it makes sense to me that the emphasis on the role of demons and the power that they do or don't have begins to wane as the Enlightenment takes hold and modern conceptions come onto the scene. But I think you're right in pointing out that while, yes, we've kind of taken that very high-minded approach, like we don't need this stuff anymore, and we were fools to believe in it in the first place, we're also kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We're being a little bit too dismissive of some of the undercurrents that formed those conceptions to begin with. It's as if saying, you know what, they never really existed at all. Those are all those things we were concerned about that kind of formulated our ideas and conceptions of demons and antithetical forces. Like those never existed. So we can ignore them. Well, no. They have existed, and we've made attempts throughout human history to explain them and personify them and wrestle with them, and they come out in our literature and our art and our storytelling because they are real. Like these things have a real kind of presence in the human experience. It's just that we have decided that, all of a sudden, the way that our ancients talked about them, like, that doesn't make sense anymore, and therefore that doesn't exist at all. I think that is the wrong conclusion to come to.
Right, and here comes Bernardo Castro for the third time in this conversation, where he would say here, this is where we make the mistake of confusing what physics is and what modern technology is, which basically is a mastering of understanding how nature behaves versus what nature is. So what we've done with modern science is we've let them replace these medieval priests as the new priesthood, basically telling us the nature of reality. But he would point out, we actually don't know what nature is. We just know enough about its behavior. We can predict how it will manifest in such a way that we've been able to transform the world and all the different criteria that you just spoke to, longer lifespans, better health, those kinds of things. But we've kind of just assumed again in that modern hubris, that contemporary hubris that seems to follow humankind through our entire history, that's because we finally got it right. So the difference between the map and the territory. So we have been able to transform the world with our map, and therefore we assume our map is sufficient to describe everything. And there is no demon, there is no alien on this map, in the modern secular map. So that's why this is so difficult to metabolize for our modern society, because it is not referenced on our maps. And interestingly, what this means is that the things that people used to wrestle with when they had more fear around these kind of beings that you spoke to kind of went away, diminished during the modern kind of experiment, right? Well, now it's coming back in, because when people started hearing about, you're saying aliens are real, which means, speaking of our last episode, they must be awfully advanced if they can be conducting these vast enterprises and us never have been aware that they're doing it. Wait a second, you're telling me they're actually abducting people and conducting these hybridization experiments? This sounds a lot like what happened in ancient biblical lore. And suddenly our security, our safety, our confidence in our modern construct begins to wane. So this is fascinating because it speaks to the psychological moment, the sociological moment we're about to enter, where it's not just about, great, more data, let's look at it. Instead, it is the undoing of our comfort with the modern construct. And that's why it's particularly difficult to think about how any announcement from a podium or even series of announcements is really going to get to this. Last point I want to make about that is to argue for something, and that is phenomenology. So to take a phenomenological approach, or rather than saying, like you said with the bones, aha, it's this or it's that. And by the way, when you brought up that example, I remember when the first Jurassic Park came out and we were in high school, right? We were taught that they were all scaly. And then I remember at one point, 10 years ago or something, there was this notion that actually a lot of dinosaurs probably had feathers. And I'm like, what? Feathers? That sounds like a completely different creature. How does it change in the course of one lifetime to such a degree? But what we really want to do here is look at the data from a phenomenological point of view, which means we look at what is clearly on the table and we don't try to pre-assemble. We don't try to attach a mental map to it until the data makes it clear that that's well supported. That's a very, very tricky enterprise for human beings. We like to lump things into categories. We don't like the unknown. So this is another way that it will inevitably change humanity, I think, because we're going to have to enter into a period where there's a lot we don't know that we used to assume we knew. So this is going to be interesting.
One quick thought on it is that, when people talk about ontological shock, it's because we've jettisoned a lot of these things. So we've not made room for a lot of the phenomenology in our current worldview. And when it happens to us, then what do you get? You get this ontological shock, this shaking of the foundations of what you knew to be possible, to be real. And so you're great to point out that we need to be careful not to discard a lot of these things, leave space for it. The more we leave space for it, the less open we are to that ontological disruption.
That's a great point. In fact, we probably need to coin a term for ontological disruption that happens on a civilization-wide kind of scale, because that's a whole kind of different kind of beast. And it tends to not happen that way in human history because we were these isolated pockets of civilization, right? So one group would evolve one way based on their experience, another way, and eventually start interacting. Now, when this news comes out, it's going to spread around the world instantaneously. So it's going to make for a really remarkable moment. All right, let's get into the co-opting of the earlier traditions as part of this evolution of demonology. So here we're going to get into pagan traditions. So as Christianity spread throughout the Roman Empire and beyond, which I referred to earlier, it often co-opted local pagan traditions, reinterpreting gods with a small g and spirits as demons. For example, small g gods like Pan and other nature deities were demonized, their attributes being absorbed into Christian demonology as representations of evil forces. We also have syncretism. In various regions, Christian demonology merged with local beliefs about spirits and the supernatural. This syncretism can be seen in practices such as the veneration of saints in places where older pre-Christian beliefs held to protective spirits and that they persisted. So again, we see these traditions that exist that aren't easily dissuaded in people because there's history to them. And again, we don't easily let go of the notions we grew up with, which speaks to what we talked about earlier. And so what you do instead is you just give a new framing of what that means. So whenever I think about what we call this podcast, it's so aptly named because we so often come back to framing. So what are your thoughts about some of that and how that is part of the evolution of demonology within Christian thought?
In a way that you can't ignore it. I mean, as the church sort of spread throughout the world and into these communities where these other belief systems had a strong hold, they became kind of forced in a way to co-opt or integrate, is a different way of looking at it, the belief systems of the people that they found themselves around. Otherwise, they weren't going to gain any ground. So they're going to observe the different sort of non-human beings that are venerated or feared in that community, and they're going to overlay onto these Christian conceptions. Well, that God that you were praying to, well, that's a demon, because it's not Jesus. Or that good person that you were venerating, well, that must be a saint. Just that you didn't have the word for it that we have for it now. So we're going to just co-opt that. You see it with festivals as well. Christmas being a great example of this, of course. And then just over time, it kind of dissolves these sort of ancient ways of looking at the world, these ancient mythologies that the Christian missionaries may have found themselves immersed in. They disappear, and Christianity sort of takes over. And I think too, who did a better job of educating communities, teaching them how to read and write over time? Well, it was the Christian church. And who would do the teaching, and who would be in those classes? Will be the children of those communities. So the children are going to begin learning. That they get at home, they get the ancient traditions, but in the church house where they're getting taught how to do these other things, they're getting this other naming and structure for it that they then just grow up believing. Well, that this is the way it is. It's a Christian perspective. So yeah, it's something that has happened. It's unfortunate in my opinion, but I think it's something that we've at least realized now that has occurred, and we're, I think, a little bit more willing to say that Christianity, wasn't just sort of something that came out of the box, a finished product, that it was something that has absolutely evolved over time, and that we owe a lot to these other communities of beliefs, that they're embedded into the Christian kind of ideology and mythology of today.
Absolutely. And I think part of our academic background involved being introduced to texts like the Enuma Elish and the Gilgamesh epic. And I remember coming across those texts that are from much more ancient traditions that predate really Jewish thought. And you can't deny the fact that it sure looks like the later tradition is borrowing from the earlier one. But even then, again, that fits with the theme we've been following here. It's not just borrowing, it's recognizing this is already the way people think, so we have to subtly shift what already exists in the culture. So we see this all the way along, this evolution, this co-option, but also this switching up just enough that it's still palatable, but moving it in a certain direction. And speaking of that, it's very interesting to think about our modern day, and I've spoken several times on Point of Convergence about Artie Six-Killer-Clark's work, really essential work she's doing. I'm so thankful for her work. We would be at such a deficit if it weren't for her work, because she's showing to the rest of us, these colonial people that came across and took over the continent, how these indigenous cultures have perceived the world and how differently they perceive the world, which seems very interestingly tied to certain connections to cosmic entities or entities maybe in other domains of reality, like shamanic tradition accesses. But when you were talking a minute ago about how we were taught certain things in church and in school and different things, I was reflecting on some accounts I was reading from one of her books today, where she was talking about these really painful examples where these kids who would speak Navajo or something were put in these American schools, forced to wear the clothing that other white Americans wore. They were punished, sometimes put in solitary confinement if they dared to speak Navajo and not English. And they were basically forced to conform to a certain way of being and a certain way of conceiving even of the world. And yet decades later, you have someone like John Mack who comes along trying to make sense from a modern perspective of what this is, what's going on, what are these abductions, what is reality, are these cosmic visitors, are there different domains of reality? And what he finds is some of the most useful information comes from these indigenous cultures who all along actually had a more intimate and integrated way of seeing these things. So finally, the white people learning from some of these ancient indigenous cultures. So there is a price to be paid when this kind of conforming happens or when it's forced on people. And I think one thing that's really remarkable and kind of beautiful about what we're going to see happen is we're going to see redemption and a vindication of many of those perspectives because of what we're encountering with the phenomenon, because it makes sense in the best way possible so far of the phenomenology that we are observing.
Well, I love the word redemption. I think that that's the word to use and consider here. I feel as if we've come to a place where we've spent so much time over the last century kind of thumbing our noses down against the past. We're so proud of where we are, and look at all that we've achieved, and we're on the pinnacle of human achievement, and that's happening right now. And these ancient peoples are our ancestors. These aren't people that are foreign. These are people that we wouldn't be here without these people. We owe our current state to their lives, and so you think about what that creates in kind of in the global human psyche. Or you've been doing this, for decade after decade after decade, just really talking down to this ancient tradition. And this has been so strong in the West, to really kind of like discard that past, to turn your back against it, to forge your own path, this radical, rugged individualism that America has so embodied. Forget about where you came from. You can be whoever you want, right? This is the narrative that we are all kind of said over here. And think about how poor that can be to your conception of just your holistic self. I kind of weep in many regards when I have family that come from an Indian background, not Native American, Indian, continental, and they have a much stronger family tradition. They have terms of endearment for all these different family members that we don't even use over here. They kind of know their family history in ways that I don't know my own. I mean, and how sad is that? I know that's, maybe my experience is unique. Maybe a lot of people know a lot about their ancestors in the United States or whatever, but I feel like that's probably not the case. We kind of only know about one generation back. And so, to sort of use that term again, redemption, this is redeeming our human history, redeeming our past, allowing us to look at it with a fresh set of eyes and to see the value that it has. And to cherish that, to celebrate that, because that is a part of us. It should inform how we look at the world. It should enrich how we look at the world, instead of us kind of taking this very high-minded, snobby view of that, saying, well, they got it all wrong and we've got it all figured out. Like, how sad is that? And that's not the world that I want to live in. So I want to see a world where we're going to redeem that. We're going to re-examine it and going to say, hey, there is a place for this. And they did understand some of these things that I understand so poorly that I need to go back and study at their feet so that I know what it is that they were talking about, and I know it in a way that I can integrate into my life today.
So true. I have the same hope. And I think, too, of one of my chief influences, which is Ken Wilber. He used to say, everybody's right to some degree. That was one of his base principles, basically, base assumptions about the nature of reality, that people don't form conceptions of reality unless they're somehow allowing them to more intelligently interact with the planet, with the larger cosmic family. It may be incomplete. It always is incomplete, actually. It's always going to be partial, just like our perspective is. But it brings a piece of the puzzle to us. And because we recognize that one of the revelations coming out of this phenomenon is that it's always been with us. We've had different terms for it. Sometimes we call them gods. Sometimes we call them demons. Sometimes we call them aliens. Sometimes we call them earth spirits. And even there's a broad spectrum, again, of these different kinds of beings. And if consciousness is primary, then it changes the way we think about the entire thing. But one of the beautiful opportunities I think we are facing right now is the possibility that all of these different cultural traditions that have inevitably encountered this aspect of life, in other words, the phenomenon or the phenomena, have something to offer. And it will be interesting to see the humbling of our modern hubris, where even now we're seeing academia beginning to step up to the plate and say, okay, there sure seems to be enough empirical data to suggest there's a there. But what we need to see next is not just that affirmation leading to new research and those kinds of things, but also a humble perspective that says that some of the data seems to be calling into question our modern conception of reality. And just like every other conception that's been superseded by a more expansive one that transcends and includes the previous one, that's the key, right? So it's not about rejecting the past, it's about including the past and transcending the past, moving into a new expansive future together, realizing that's always been the nature of the enterprise for humankind, and to be a sentient being in an incarnated existence altogether. So that's what we're facing, and I think that's an opportunity we should all look forward to.
Yeah, the opportunity is knocking, and all we have to do is answer that. And I think that our audience, I've been inspired by the audience that we have, and the willingness that they have shared with us to go along on this journey with Liminal Phrames and the places that we go, the territory that we have covered. It makes me hopeful that when this does continue to unfold, that we'll be at a place where we've got a lot of folks who are prepared to have that conversation, that are prepared to say to those that they love and know and spend their days with and time with, I understand that you might think that it's this, but have you considered that it could also be this? And have you considered there's a broader possibility at work here? I'm not going to tell you you're wrong because, like you said, everyone is right to a degree. But I'm going to challenge you to really think a little bit more broadly about what this could be and suspend some judgment. I mean, gosh, we need to do more of that. Suspend some judgment about what this is and make room for awe and wonder and hope. Because there is plenty to spare with this topic. And it's not to say that it's all, sunshine and roses, right? There's a lot of work to be done to really fully understand the ins and outs of this and the very sort of scary parts of it as well. I think we need to be willing to confront some of those aspects and not, pretend that they don't exist, because they clearly do. They're part of the literature and the experience. So I'm excited for where this is going, and I'm grateful that everybody's here along with us on that journey. So on that note, we will close. Thank you very much for listening. I hope to see you next time on the next episode of Liminal Phrames. May the quality of our questions, shaped by a desire for understanding, enhance our journey of discovery, and may our travels broaden the sphere of our consciousness, reminding us that new discoveries beget new horizons. As always, adventure awaits. We'll see you next time on Liminal Phrames.